I was treated like a foreigner, which is fair enough. Like I probably came across that way because I was born and raised in Europe. I probably spoke Hindi with a weird accent. I wore like, clothes that gave me away, like my mannerisms, the way I held myself. European kids maybe are taught to be quite confident. They meet everyone's eye, and like in Indian culture, like you might look down a little bit if you're talking to your elders and, things like that. So there were all these social cues that I kind of had to learn or that I knew of, but they weren't me. Like I knew that people did them, but like they weren't me, and I had to kind of learn that.
Welcome to Third Culture Therapy, a podcast that looks at the unique ways our social identity and cultural heritage impact our mental and emotional well-being. I'm Layla Maghribi, writer, journalist, and host of this show. Hello listeners, welcome to the show. This week's guest is Swedish-born Indian Bhanu, who talks about the challenges of growing up between two very different cultures and the emotional difficulties he faced coming out to his family as gay and how yoga helped him through it. But first, let me tell you a little bit more about him. Bhanu Bhatnagar is a former journalist and communications expert. He's currently in charge of press and media relations for the World Health Organization's regional office for Europe and is based in Denmark. Bhanu is your textbook third culture kid. Born in Sweden to Indian parents, he's lived in Sweden, Belgium, India, Northern Ireland, England, Qatar, Thailand, and now Denmark. After toiling as a producer and reporter at Al Jazeera English for over a decade, Bhanu moved into the third sector, working with the media teams at the INGO Save the Children, which is where he and I first met, before joining the WHO a couple of years ago. Bhanu, welcome to Third Culture Therapy. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much, Layla.
That was a lot of countries that I listed there. First off, I want to know, do you have a favorite?
Yeah, there's no easy answer to that, I think. And I think you probably relate, and other third culture kids, I'm sure, will also relate. I always dread that question when people ask me that at parties or, gatherings. I mean, it's like comparing apples and oranges. How do you compare the craziness of New Delhi to the prim and proper of Stockholm? They all have their place, they all have their annoyances, and they all have their beauty. But I can certainly, to answer your question sort of short, I guess, would be that I think my favorite place is probably India, insofar as it's where my heritage is, and it's where my people are from, and I think it's where I'm always going to have a nostalgic sense of that part of the world, and we can maybe discuss that more. But I'm equally at home in Denmark now. Home is where I find myself, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does, and we're definitely going to explore what that means to you. But going back, so you mentioned India, and you have an interesting life story insofar as you've kind of done what I would call the reverse migration, which is that you were born in Sweden and lived there for several years, and then you went and lived in India. How old were you when you made that change or that move?
Yeah, so I went kicking and screaming. Like I went, I was 13 years old. So I was born in Europe and lived in Northern Europe for the first 13 years of my life. It was who I was. I was a brown kid growing up in white Europe, and that was sort of shaping who I was. And then at age 13, which is an extremely difficult age, as anyone who's been 13 can attest to, my parents decided to move back to India. Well, back for them, but for me, it was moving to India for the first time. And I think this is a really interesting sort of quirk, I guess, of my life, because, most immigrants, most people who leave their country and culture for economic reasons, like my parents did, they weren't refugees, they were economic migrants. There's this sort of goal it might be conscious or unconscious, to return one day. They haven't left because they hate their country or that they were forced out or anything. They left for better opportunities, and there's this sort of yearning to come back one day. And that's what my parents did when I was 13 years old. They moved back, and that was really hard for me. I did not like my parents for a good while. Being a 13, 14-year-old, to me, back in India, because to me, India was a place you went to visit grandparents and aunties and uncles and eat all the great food and probably get Delhi belly, and have a good dance and, and like do all the fun things that we do as sort of Indians or South Asians, but then come back to my life in Europe. And so the prospect of living in India indefinitely, yeah, it wasn't very nice. It wasn't very fun. Having said that, today I cannot thank my parents enough, and it's really interesting because there were at least 2 or 3 years where I despised my parents for making my life so hard. I found it really hard to make friends. It was a difficult age. They made me change my school like a couple of times, and so it was just a tough time, and I just thought I'd never forgive them for it. But when I left India, having graduated from high school, I left with a stronger sense of who I am. And something my parents would say to us growing up in Sweden, to me and my brother, was that you will never be a full Swede. And this was not said in a sort of a racist tone or anything. And I don't want to make it out like I had some horrible racist experiences or anything like that. I really didn't. I grew up in a very multicultural type of environment and on the whole quite tolerant. But my parents were very much like, you are not a Swede. You should absolutely integrate into this country, learn the language, maybe even fall in love. They were fine with that too. But they were like, you will never be accepted as one of their own.
Yeah, no, I totally understand that. That was very much the same in my family, and something I touched on in the previous episodes with a couple of my guests, the sense of like my parents were like, you're British, so far as you have the rights of being a Brit, and you absolutely integrate into the society, and you are part of it. However, there was always this barrier and this understanding that you're never going to be fully of here. And so it's important to maintain the ties with back home and our heritage being from the Middle East. And for me, even though I didn't get to live there for prolonged periods like you, the yearly summer-long visits to Syria were a must. And more than that, the language, because we weren't going to be living there, they really stressed the need to learn Arabic. And while I also similarly found it incredibly annoying, frustrating to spend my Saturdays and my summer holidays learning Arabic, and I was like, argh. But today, as you say, I'm like, thank you so much, Mom and Dad. Thank you for not listening to me, for ignoring my rants and my sulks and all of that jazz, because having that tie is incredible.
It's really so true. Incredible. It's so true. Like it was a very similar parallel in my childhood, because we my parents made sure they spoke in Hindi in the home. And then obviously as a kid in any country, you make friends with kids on the playground. And so I obviously just picked up Swedish as a kid would. And then when it was time to go to school, they sent me to an English medium school. So by age 7, I was speaking all 3 of those languages. And I still remember there was this Indian lady who would give us Hindi lessons on a Sunday at the Indian embassy in Stockholm. And again, it was one of those chores, that I was like, I cannot believe, my mom is ruining my Sunday. But to this day, yeah, I certainly can't read Hindi novels, but to this day, when I'm in India and I see billboards and newspaper headlines and things like that, I can pick out the words, I can pick out the letters, and that's all thanks to those horrible Sundays. You
Yeah,
know?
yeah. Those horrible Sundays. You mentioned that when you were growing up in Sweden, you said, up until 13, I was this like brown kid in Sweden. And I wanted to get you to expand on that. But you said at the same time that you didn't experience necessarily racism. So what do you mean by you were this brown kid in Sweden? Like, what did that mean to you?
I always knew that I stood out, by virtue of the way I look. And again, not racist, just fact, right? And, I always stood out particularly in the 80s. So Sweden wasn't as multicultural as it is today. Today, like I think, Sweden's a very different place. Certainly, Stockholm. I think almost half of the population in Stockholm, they say, is foreign born or has some foreign born roots. But back then, it was super white. So I was aware of the difference, and then I was also aware of the difference at home. While my parents are very progressive and open, there are certain things they liked in the home, like we ate Indian food daily. Yeah, and that was the thing. It was like the evening meal was always Indian food. And I used to hate it for years. I used to hate it, because I was like, I wanted to be the white kid eating
Right.
spaghetti bolognese or eating, whatever, like quiche. which,
Meatballs.
yeah,
Swedes really like
exactly.
their
And it's like,
meatballs, right?
really, we're having dal and roti again? And now, like, I can't get enough of it. But so I think navigating those things and understanding that like I was different, but that was okay. But then that confusion of, but then I'm different, but where do I belong? Like
Yeah.
who are my people? you know?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I want to tell you a funny story that ties into a little bit like when you mentioned the difference at home and your family saying being progressive, but there being limits to it. So, my family also I'd consider quite liberal and progressive in many ways, but also, traditional in others, and definitely had this sense of, as I mentioned, wanted to really make us aware that we were Arab and we had certain cultural values and traditions. And so my dad, whenever he felt, and so we're a family of women, I have two sisters, whenever he felt like me and my sisters were maybe becoming a little bit too liberal for his liking,
Yeah.
what he would say is, where do you think we're from? Sweden? Because for him, the benchmark of like uber liberalism was Sweden. And
that's
so
hilarious.
he's like, we're not from Sweden. I was
That's
like, what's
hilarious.
Sweden got to do with it? And then the funny thing is I made a very good friend at school who remains my best friend to this day, 20 years later, who's Swedish. And ironically,
That's a connection here to Sweden.
yeah.
Yeah.
Weird. I don't know how. I've never even, I hadn't been there until my 20s. But her family was actually quite conservative and themselves and traditional. And so when he was talking to me about like sweet, and I had in my conjuring up like these really wild, loose type, I don't know, whatever he was conjuring up some weird image, and I couldn't really understand it. But then what I was seeing in front of me was very, very different. But anyway, it was quite funny that was his way of sort of laying down the law. We're not Swedish.
That's very funny. That's very funny.
Did your family have any sort of issues with any of the values or traditions or way of being in Sweden, that they were a bit like, hey, this isn't what we do, or this isn't how we as a family, or whether as an Indian culture agree with?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, things like even as a young kid, like staying out too late, like past sunset and stuff. And I mean, I know I was a kid, but it was an innocent time, and we had like parks nearby, and all of my neighbors' kids and stuff would play. Like they would play till well into the evening, but like I wasn't allowed, like because bad things happen at night, and things like that. And to be honest with you, like those. So I think that kind of thing where parents have an issue with the sort of the different cultural expressions of life actually came for me later as a teenager, right? Because that's when you want to go out. That's when you need money. That's when you want to, drink and do all the things that parents don't want you to do. And for me, that was in India. Okay. So,
Yeah.
like, it was in India and it was at an international school. So again, like, how confusing is that? So, like, you go back to India, these are your people, it's like a homecoming, and you're going back to your country. And then I was placed, to keep my education consistent in an international school, where I didn't really have very many Indian friends. They were from all over the world, and they were loaded because they were like diplomats' kids or they were like UN kids and things like that. And they they had mobile phones when they still hadn't been invented, and they would stay out late and they would go out drinking and they had pocket money, and so those kinds of things were things I would have to argue with my parents about.
Did you were saying in your Sweden years that there was this disconnect and between being Swedish, being Indian, being brown in a white world, and the sense of belonging fully and knowing who you are. Did you get that sense of belonging then when you went to India at 13?
Not straight away, no, and that's because I was seething. It was very hard for me to integrate into this society. It just it felt a little less free than life in Sweden did, because you couldn't just like go out of your house and hop on a bus, and like everything had to be planned, and everything, your movements had to be planned, and everyone had to know, and it was a more unsafe society. So whereas my mom would be fine with me walking around on the street in Stockholm, like in our neighborhood, that would not be the case in India. Kidnappings happen, and all kinds of things. So yes, but culturally, yes, but that took time. I don't think I really valued or got that sense of belonging until I kind of left India, sort of a young man, a teenager, 17, 18 years old. So it took several years, and that was because of the exposure I had to, obviously, India and the culture and the people, but then my family, and like my extended family. And I, again, feel that's another reason I feel so blessed that I was able to kindle those relationships at that age. This is going to sound crazy, but like, so I have four aunties on my mom's side. So they're five girls. My mom's the oldest of five girls, and in Sweden, the word for sorry, not in Sweden, in India, in Hindi, the word for maternal aunt is masi, which is shorthand for ma Jessie, which means like mother.
Oh.
And it's funny because I sometimes think my when my mom is gone, that I will just have another mother, like stepping up,
Aw.
like into that role. And there's going to be four. There's going to be four of them.
Lucky you.
Do you know what I mean? No, but like,
Yeah.
I mean,
No,
listen,
I know.
I haven't discussed this with them, but it's just how, and I only think that way because of that sense of belonging
Yeah.
that was cultivated during those really crucial years. That's why I brought it up.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think it's such a beautiful thing. I'm glad that you had that experience, because I think one of the big drawbacks to migrating, being third culture, is that you often lose this connection to the extended family and the community that we come to realize later in life are really integral to our sense of self, but also to our mental and emotional well-being, right? Knowing that there is more than just your immediate, mom, mother, father, if you are lucky to have enough to have both, that there are more, and there are generations, and there's like there's like a buffer around you, which is a beautiful and can be incredibly enriching and like safe thing to have.
And it's so true. And also understanding like your story, like yours and the generational story that brought you to where you are today, right?
Yeah.
If I may, like just quickly, tell you that like, the migration story within my own family is fascinating because my grandmother was a refugee. Like she was a refugee at the time of the partition of the Indian subcontinent. Our family came from Lahore, which is in present-day Pakistan, and they found themselves on the wrong side of the border on the wrong, with the wrong religion. And then, life happened. She married my grandfather. She built a family. They built everything from scratch. And then, a generation later, my mom and dad meet in Delhi, and then they migrate. And that was a voluntary migration. And then they migrate, and then their life happens. And then I come along and my brother comes along, and then, you listed all the countries I lived in. So that's crazy. Like my grandmother,
Yeah.
one forced migration, my parents, one economic migration, and I've already
Yeah.
lived in like 8 countries or however many that is.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow, that is incredible. Do you think, going back to the forced migration of your grandmother and as a result of the forced partition, how much, if at all, do you feel like that's impacted your family over the
Wow,
years?
that's
I know.
hugely. My goodness, I think those kinds of events are like they're traumatic. I think that goes without saying, but they're not just traumatic for the individual that went through it, namely my grandmother, who I think was a teenager at the time, like maybe 14, 15, something like that. But I grew up listening to stories, that she would tell of that time. Scary stories. Like she saw people having their throats slit. She saw people being, accosted and molested. And she saw people being robbed. She saw death. She saw murder. She saw, no, a lot of horrible things. Obviously, that left an impression on her and a kind of a lived trauma, even though she was a teenager at the time. When she then had a family, when she became a woman and she had a family, she passed those stories on to her children, and not just the stories, but that feeling. It's an emotion that you pass
Yeah.
on. Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
It's so
Yes.
the
Yes.
stories are
Yes.
one thing, but it's the emotion that they elicit. They are passed down, and that or that story or those emotions have a very clear like good guy and a bad guy. There's very clear kind of black and whites, and I think we do that as a species. We are a sort of social cultural being, and when we go through trauma like that, in our own experience, or in our own truth rather, because there's so many versions of truth, in our own truth we know what's right. We know who wronged us. And so those stories were passed down, to my grandmother still tells them to this day. She's still alive, bless her. And uh, so that very much had an impact on the family and the way we understand sort of our ancestry, our place in the subcontinent, how the resilience as well of our family, because my grandmother's side lost everything. They were kind
Yeah.
of a wealthy-ish family before partition, and they lost everything. They lost their home, they lost their buffalo, they lost everything, and had to start from scratch. And then look where their progeny is today, right? Like
Mm.
they, so things have turned out all right, or at least there are silver linings.
I want to touch again on your relationship with India and how you felt when you were there, and culturally speaking, because you kind of touched on this a bit before when we've chatted about the sense of like, on the yes, there's a homecoming, but also because you come with like 13 years of living in Sweden, you're also an outsider. And did you feel that, or how did you handle that? But also, what I suppose did you find really in conflict when you arrived there, whether it's your values or your sense of self and belonging from another place to India, and how did it compare?
Yeah, you're right that like we've sort of alluded to this already, that like as a child our parents were telling us you don't you're not fully Swedish, you belong to this culture or to this country, and then as far as they're concerned, I had the privilege to actually go and live in the country that I'm from. And I arrive in that country, to India, and I quickly start to realize that actually I'm not really seen as Indian here either. At least not by your average not by like the general society. Of course, family is a different thing, but in the interactions I had with non-family, um, I was treated like a foreigner, which is fair enough. Like I probably came across that way because I was born and raised in Europe. I probably spoke Hindi with a weird accent. I wore like clothes that gave me away, like my mannerisms, the way I held myself. European kids maybe are taught to be quite confident. They meet everyone's eye. And like in Indian culture, like you might look down a little bit if you're talking to your elders and things like that. So there were all these social cues that I kind of had to learn or that I knew of, but they weren't me. Like I knew that people did them, but like they weren't me, and I had to kind of learn that. I just remembered, in our culture, we, as a sign of respect to our elders, particularly grandparents and anyone who's older, really, we bow down and we touch their feet.
Mm-hmm.
Or we make a gesture that we're touching their feet. So we don't physically touch their feet, but we just extend our hand down, and it's a sort of a sign of submission, and it's a sign of respect to elders. And I remember, my parents wanting me to do that to grandparents. Well, actually, they started off wanting me to do it to everyone, and I was
You were
like,
like,
they're
no.
like, and I was like, "Are you kidding me?" Like, I was like, "Let's just start with Sonima, like, which is what I call my grandmother." I was like, "Let's
Yeah.
just start with grandma." And anyway, it's funny because the more you do something, the more you realize what a kind of beautiful thing it is. Because
Yeah.
every time I did it, just all these blessings would shower on me from my grandmother, and she'd just say all these lovely things, and like live 100 lives, and all the kind of flowery stuff that our cultures are so good at. And now I do it. Like now I do it
Mm-hmm.
without thinking. If I see my grandma, sometimes I'll even do it to my parents if I haven't seen them for a long time. Because let's be honest, they're old too now.
Oh, bless them. Yeah, and you get all those blessings.
Yes.
Speaking of blessings, obviously India is very well known for being a very spiritual place, home of many different practices, religious practices, spiritual practices. And I wanted to ask what parts of that culture you have connected with on that level. And I guess what you have taken from it or continue to that maybe does, I guess, bring you closer to whether it's spirituality or your emotional, mental sense of self.
Hmm.
If you tapped into that when you were there or afterwards.
So this is a really interesting question. It's something I've been thinking about, and I think I kind of think about it a lot. I'm kind of very lucky in the sense that one of my like mental health tools, and like we can talk about that in a second. I think everyone needs a tool, a mechanism. Like it could be anything. It could be walking or playing football or meditating or whatever. But one of my mental health tools is also a mechanism for me to connect with my culture, and that's yoga. Um,
Mm,
and I've been doing yoga now, sort of, it's like, yeah, 15 years maybe,
mm-hmm,
and teaching for about six or seven of those. But I teach just on the side. The yoga for me is a very personal practice, and it really has kind of been my lifesaver and my
mm,
therapist. Um,
mm,
and people say, oh, well, how can a practice be a therapist?
mm.
And like we can go down a
Absolutely
rabbit.
can.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. But like,
absolutely can. Yeah.
but like we can go down this rabbit hole on this. But like, I feel like we all have, even those of us who are damaged, and we're all a little bit damaged and flawed. All of us have this inner voice, this inner kind of wisdom, but we've lost it,
Mm-hmm.
or we're unable to hear it.
Yeah.
And for me personally, like that voice has been awakening since I started doing yoga, and it's still awakening. Like it's not like it's a work in progress, and it will be, I think, for the rest of my life. I mean, it all kind of started with the sort of trauma of me coming out as a gay man. And I think, ironically, I was okay. I don't know if we're going to go down this whole rabbit hole, but ironically, I was introduced to yoga by an ex-girlfriend of mine. And yes, I am gay now, but I had a girlfriend back then. And again, this was part, I guess, of me negotiating who I was and doing what I thought society wanted me to do. Um, she was non-Indian, or she is non-Indian, and she dragged me to my first yoga class. I remember she guilted me. She was like, "How could you never even have tried yoga? Like you're Indian, as if, you know." I don't know. It was just a
Wow.
funny. It was just a funny
Yeah.
thing. It's like, oh, like someone from not my culture is like projecting like who she'd been doing yoga for a long time, and it meant something to her. And so she was like, I can't believe you, like you're such a bad Indian, basically. She took me to my first yoga class, and I liked it. I maybe like is a strong word, but I didn't dislike it. And so I
Hmm.
thought, okay, I can go back, and then sort of one thing led to another. And it's funny because this girl, this ex-girlfriend, obviously she was sort of part of my life journey, but she came into my life, I think, for a very special reason, and it was
Yeah.
yoga. It was
Wow.
to kind of start me on my own spiritual path of self-discovery, of self-love.
Yeah.
I'm still very good friends with her today, and she's very close to my now partner, and I'm godparent to her children and stuff. So we've maintained a very good and open relationship, and I think that was the reason. Like we understood that self-love and self-growth comes from like non-judgment.
Yeah.
It comes from being open and yeah, and not sort of wanting things to go the way that you want them to go all the time.
Gosh, what a beautiful story. That's such
Oh,
a
thank you.
beautiful story and a
Thank
great
you.
encounter that you had. I completely agree with you that some people do come into your life for different reasons and they're not always meant to stay and or sometimes they do, but not in the way that you think. If you can stay open to that, then that's very it can be very fruitful, it can be very, very fruitful. I didn't know this story and I didn't actually know when it was that you had come out. But obviously now I'm gathering that it was a bit later in life.
Yes.
Was that struggle or that awareness of around your sexuality present beforehand? And you touched on it being traumatic coming out. Can you expand on that a bit?
So, yes, I think it was around. Where do I start? So, I think as anyone who is LGBTQI or anyone who has sort of questioned their own sort of sexuality or gender can attest to, it is a uniquely personal experience. I have friends who like they just knew they were gay at age 8. They just knew, and there was no question, and they knew who they were, and they accepted themselves, and they loved themselves, and that was that. But that wasn't the case for me. And I think for probably most people who might be TCK, or certainly people who grew up in Asian or Arab or Middle Eastern cultures, there was a tremendous amount of kind of soul searching. And if I think back far enough, I think I always knew, but didn't really know, or didn't really know how I could live that life, if that makes sense. Like live it and like authentically, without um, without essentially like lighting all of my relationships on fire, and potentially losing the people that are dearest to me, namely like my immediate family and things like that. I mean, those fears never materialized, but those were very, very real fears that I had, and so my girlfriend was kind of part of that journey. My ex-girlfriend, she kind of, we went to university together, and then, next thing we knew, we were getting along really well, and then, we started dating, and I, everything just kind of happened without me trying too hard, and I thought, oh my goodness, like maybe I'm not gay, like I was like in my early 20s, and I remember thinking, oh, so these thoughts that I have about, other guys or whatever, like, okay, well, maybe I'm just bisexual. Like, I didn't really know what was what, or what label, but I just knew that it was working with this ex-girlfriend. And so I thought, okay, let's just go with it. Let's just go with it. Maybe I can be, that saying, like, fake it till you make it.
Yeah.
I genuinely thought that I was going to fake it until I made it, until I made it real.
Yeah.
Until like we got married and we had kids, and then next thing I know, that those, even if I had sort of gay thoughts or whatever, that was just kind of a fantasy, and you got on with life. Luckily, I'm a very honest person, and I don't like to lie to people I love and stuff. So I was very honest with my ex-girlfriend. I told her these things, and she accepted me 100% and said, "Well, that's great. That's you. You're probably bi, so that's okay." And so I was very lucky in that sense to have someone like that. But let's fast forward 3 years into the relationship, and it ended for different reasons. She wanted to build a family, and I wasn't ready for that at that age, I guess. But I guess we both know why it really ended, but we didn't really discuss it. And then that's where my trauma really kicked in, because I I was at a crossroads. I was 27 or 28 years old. I was in my mind. I was like, oh my God, I'm going to be 30 years old, and I don't know who I am. It was like I'm going to cry just thinking about it. It was devastating to me that like I couldn't be fully, gay or out, or at least I wasn't allowing myself to be. And then when my relationship ended with my ex-girlfriend, I missed her so terribly much because, gay or straight, when you're with someone for that long, they get under your skin. And so I was so traumatized by it was the first time I had my heart broken, but I had a broken heart, but I knew that I couldn't like fix it with her or with another girl. And at the time I was trying to go on dates with other women. I'm like, okay, it's fine. When I move on, I'm going to fake it till I make it. Uh, and it was just creating more anxiety inside me. Like I feel like I could only have been this girl's boyfriend. I couldn't have been
Yeah.
any other person's, because she loved and accepted me in a way that allowed me to just be. And that's where my trauma really kicked in. And at the time, if I can plug a book that really helped me during that time, it's a very famous book. It's called The Power of Now.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
by
Me too.
Eckhart Tolle. Yeah, and someone, oh yes, a flatmate gave it to me at that time. She could tell I was distressed and distraught, and she just said, here's a book if you want to flick through some pages. And I kid you not, Layla, I opened the book and I didn't put it down. Like for 3 days straight, I read the whole thing, crying my eyes out. Like I felt like, have you read it?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know
Yeah.
what I mean. Like
Yeah.
I felt like the things he was saying in the book were literally my life.
Yeah.
The layers that you build around yourself, the lies that you tell yourself that become truth. The pain, like the pain body that we
Yeah.
carry around with us, that then manifests in like a bad back or a bad neck, or snapping or anxiety or fear or anger and these things. But anyway, so that book really helped me and to deal with the trauma of that. And then I decided, right, enough is enough. Few people knew that I was, you know, um, gay or bi, or I wasn't really labeling myself at that point. But I decided enough is enough. If I need to be authentic and true to myself, I need to actually be authentic and true to the people in my life. That's the first step. So I remember taking my brother out for dinner, and I said, I still remember the exact words I said to him. I said, "What would you say if I told you I was gay?" And he just looked at me. And this is why I love my brother so much, because he said, well, if you are, it means I have to marry an Indian. It
Oh
was,
my goodness.
it was so sweet because,
That
yeah,
is so cute.
isn't that cute? But basically, what he was trying to say is that, like, listen, I don't like. It's not an issue. It's not a big deal. Like, let's worry
Yeah.
about me. It's so at a time when I was very vulnerable and very kind of, I just needed someone to tell me that, like, dude, it really doesn't matter.
Wow.
And then I said to him, I said, look, now that I've told you, I want to tell mom and dad. And he looked at me and he went, really? He went, do you have to? Like, do you have to do it like now?
Mm.
And I said, yes. I'm pushing 30 years old. They're constantly sending like girls to me, like, in Indian culture, they're like, oh, so and so has a daughter and she lives in Wembley and you should go meet her, and so like proper like matchmaking,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I said, I can't keep lying, like I can't keep doing that. And my brother was like, why don't you just like live your gay life for a little while and
Mm.
then tell them? And I was like, no, 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 no. Like I just felt like life had been passing me by all those previous
Mm.
years, and I was like, I don't want to be in the closet. And then we hatched this big plan for me to, and he supported me throughout the whole thing. Like, we flew over to Sweden, and I was there in person, and I also sent them a letter explaining lots of things. And that was also a traumatic time.
Mm.
But my worst fears were that, that they would hate me. I think that's the
Yeah.
worst fear of anyone who's struggling with this and who thinks that they will be rejected by the people who they love. That they would hate me, that they would disown me, that they wouldn't want anything to do with me. And none of that was true. But they were in pain,
Yeah.
and it's because I guess they didn't know, and I can't blame them either. Like they didn't grow up in a culture surrounded by sort of gay popular culture,
Mm.
like pride festivals and the rainbow flag, and just stuff that I've grown up with, and so they didn't have a reference point, and I think maybe they thought the worst. And so I was like into trying my best to help them understand that, I don't know. I don't know. Like, I don't even know what they thought, but in my mind, I thought they thought the worst, that I was somehow like a deviant of some kind, or that I was like selling my body or some, like
Mm.
just crazy
Mm-hmm.
shit,
Yeah.
and I just wanted them to understand that, like, no, like, in fact, I was like, I actually have straight friends who are way more deviant,
Yeah.
like,
A bit, yeah, a bit like explaining to the Sweden comparing, not quite, but like my dad comparing like Sweden as being, this like wild place. And I'm like, actually, they're pretty mellow over there. But yeah.
yeah.
So I'm glad that the experience ultimately worked out for you. But it's interesting the way you describe your parents. Obviously there was grief and sadness there, but that they thought the worst, like as if, well, I guess being gay is the worst, which is obviously, we know, not the case, but sadly a lot of people's perception, depending on how they've been raised or what the association with it is. And often that is tied very much into culture, and culture, by culture I also mean like both sort of maybe socially, and that ties into like religious culture, but also like legally. And I mean, the fact, the truth is, as I'm sure you're aware, in India, homosexuality was only decriminalized a few years ago in
Yeah.
2015.
Yeah.
And so obviously your parents would have been growing up in a society, in a culture in which that was wrong. That was the worst thing, because that was literally said to be. It was a
Yeah.
criminal act. So of
Yeah.
course you're going to have this perception of it being the worst thing. That's without even taking into account other aspects of it, socially and religion. But that, they're all intermixed, because you can't really be accepting something socially if legally unless you have a very particularly open mind view and you're able to kind of transcend.
Yeah.
But I think, even more interesting to me, and I kind of wonder if I mean, yeah, it ties into like some of the questions I want to ask about your homosexuality and how that ties in with your culture, is that it wasn't, historically, if you go back in the ages in India, homosexuality wasn't always viewed this way.
No.
And actually, in ancient scriptures, you have a lot of reference to homosexuality. In the Kama Sutra, there's a whole chapter on homosexuality. It was actually very much a part of the Indian culture for a long period of time, and it was actually the British colonialists who made it illegal during their 200-year colonization of India. So
Yes.
I want to insert that in because I think a lot of people don't know that, and
Yes.
I also feel like, yeah, you know what? We should understand the history a little bit better to understand where all of this fits in.
Yeah, I think you make a really, really good point, and the word that instantly springs to mind is decolonization, right? Decolonization of the mind. And I think that's just happening in post-colonial societies across the world, across the Middle East and across, certainly the subcontinent, where, and this is why there's so much heated debate everywhere. And there's people are like so either for or against like deeply polarizing kind of debates about like taking back ownership of your education system or taking back ownership of like your artifacts that were like looted and are sitting in museums like halfway around the world, right? So this is all part of decolonizing the mind, which gets kind of the mind does get colonized, right? Like you just explained it really well there that the way society viewed homosexuality was in a way a colonization of their minds to make them think a certain way that was predicated on fear and fear of the other or whatever you want to call it. But also in our, just coming back to the like my parents and stuff, like in our culture, marriage and family is so important. Like it's one of those, and I think it's the same for you as well. Like it's one of those things. It's like you go to university, you get married. It's like you kind of have to do it, or there's something wrong. With you, and so that was my biggest guilt. Of coming out. I have lots of guilt, and actually my yoga really helps me process that guilt. Going back to that therapy thing, but I carried a lot of guilt with me for so long that I wasn't able to give my parents what they expected, and I kind of wanted too, because I was raised to kind of want it. I was kind of raised to want that big fat Indian wedding, which may still happen one day, but it's to a woman, and so I just I just think that's been part of the process of dealing with the guilt.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of grief around that, isn't there? As you said, your parents had this ideal, you had this ideal, society puts on this ideal, and it is sad that with in honoring your truth and living it, it invariably comes with a loss. Even if that loss is necessary and good in the long term, there is a period of grief that comes with it. In terms of like how Indian culture and your connection to it changed at all after you came out, did it at all, or did it stay the same? Like, did you feel at all that because it wasn't accepted within that culture, or at least by the maybe the majority, that did it cause any sort of, I don't know, schism between you and
Yes,
it?
absolutely. I really resented the fact that my parents didn't tell any of the extended family for years, and I thought. And I didn't want to do it because I thought somehow that would be disrespectful to my parents. Like I did my duty as a son by telling them and being honest with them because I love them. And also that's who I owe, like my parents, like I owe them at the very least honesty. So I felt like I did my duty, but I felt like they were deep down somewhere, they were ashamed or ashamed the word, or yeah, they were ashamed, or they were disappointed, or whatever, that, or they just couldn't face those conversations because they didn't know how to have them. Like, it goes back to this reference point thing, but it really bothered me for a long time. And then I told one of my aunties, and she instantly was like, "Oh my gosh, like I've been waiting all my life for you to tell me, like, like, why didn't you just say something earlier? Like, I've known since you were 12 years old." And I was like, so
What?
yeah, exactly. And so
Wow.
then I finally had an ally in the family, and I was like, "Okay, like, do you know why mom and dad don't say anything, this and that?" And then, so I had, and that's all it takes. You just need to kind of find people within my family. Like, now my grandmother knows as well, believe it or not.
Wow.
Yes. And she asked me when I was in Delhi last time, and she literally just came up with it in like really slang Punjabi, and she basically said, "Have you found a nice boy yet?" This is like my 90-plus-year-old grandmother. So,
Aw.
you know, uh, I think my parents were unduly concerned. They were carrying baggage. And I think this goes back to, like, I'm second guessing now because I don't know, I can't get inside their heads. But I think a lot of parents, maybe my parents, felt like it was their fault in some way, or that they were to
Mm.
blame in some way. And I think that's not, I think that's true of many parents of gay children, that they might think that way. And so I think that might have prevented them from like advertising it, because that they maybe felt
Mm.
like it was a reflection on them. And then
Yeah.
I think slowly over the years, they've come to realize that it isn't, and that I am loved, that they are loved by the whole family, and that actually the truth only makes us stronger.
Aw. Beautiful.
Yeah.
That's really beautiful. I just love that. I'm getting conjuring this image of your 90-plus-year-old grandma just being like, "So, have you met a nice boy?" But I think it just goes to show how, in the end, everyone, like, once they can get over themselves, everyone's united by this like quest for love.
Yes,
Even she's just like, "Fine, right, you're gay now. Can we get
exactly.
back to the matter at hand, which is partnering you up with
Exactly.
someone?"
But I mean, do you know what she said after I said yes? I have found a nice boy. Um, I'm translating now, but it's basically along the lines of, she basically said, "Good. I'm glad your heart is full." Or I'm glad your heart is busy. That's the exact translation.
Aw.
And that is to say, like, a wavering heart, or someone who wants to love but is not getting love back, can lead to depression and anxiety and all these things. And she's basically saying, "I don't care who you love, just
Mm.
love." You know?
Yeah. Well, love is a healer. Absolutely,
Yes.
like love is definitely a healer, and obviously yoga is too for you. Are there any other tools that you have lent on in the past or continue to, whether from your culture or otherwise? And by culture, I
Mm,
should also include Sweden in this, by the way. I know we focused a lot on India, but you
yeah.
are Swedish as well.
I mean, I think for me, like, nature and being in nature, and outside and having an active lifestyle, I have found is really important for my mental well-being. Yoga obviously has a physical aspect to it, and I think that's part of the reason I'm drawn to it. But then it's also about quieting the mind and being still. So it has that sort of yin and yang, which I love. But then I love going mental, like in the gym, or something, like, or running, or rowing or something. Just like really getting my heart rate up, and like getting all the anxiety, the subconscious anxiety out of my system. Like, I feel great. It's like being high afterwards, like all these endorphins being released. And it's funny because it seems like such a simple tool, but I have heard over the years, I've met people who are bipolar, who have depression, like diagnosed depression, and other issues. And I kid you not, almost 100% of them say they either like lean on exercise to help them through their condition, or that they should be doing more exercise to help them through
Mm-hmm.
their condition, like they're not doing enough. And I think there's something to be said for that. Like, I think we need to get away from this sort of pill popping culture all the time, and just get out there. Like, my brother's a doctor, and he often says he wishes he could prescribe like a long walk to his patients, because
Were
he's
they
like,
doing that at a certain
Well, I think they're
point?
slowly starting to. Like, I think they've actually put yoga now. He works for the NHS. I think they put yoga now as actually doctors can prescribe yoga as like, as something to do for certain conditions. But my brother's point was, he gets all these patients coming in who literally just want them to write a prescription for a particular drug or particular this or that they're leaning on, that they rely on. And he's like, all you really need is just, you know, go to a nice forest and have a nice long walk, you know?
That's very true. Do you do much walking in Denmark?
I do. Well, in Denmark, I cycle everywhere. It's a
Of
cycling city.
course, of
So,
course.
yeah, cycle everywhere here, even in the rain and the wind and stuff.
Just to kind of wrap up, I wanted to ask, like, you're now obviously in a Scandinavian country and you grew up in partially in a Scandinavian country. How do you find, if any, there are any differences with the way in which mental and emotional health are expressed or dealt with, or even like tools used in that part of the world versus in the more eastern, like India part of the world?
So I think what you're asking about is this sort of is therapy essentially, right? Because I mean, therapy is the main tool I think that Western society uses, and that's great. Like my brother goes to therapy too, and he's given me permission to say this, and it's really helped him. I haven't done therapy yet. That is not to say I'm not open to it, but I remember when my brother told my parents that he was seeing a therapist, like my mom lost her shit, basically. She was like, "You're doing what?" And I think it comes from this cultural place. Like, why are you airing your dirty laundry? Like, why are you airing your dirty laundry to a total stranger? Like, come and talk to us. And my brother's like you're part of the problem. Like, I kind of wanted to discuss you guys a little bit, and they're like, what? Like, they didn't understand, and
Yeah.
and so to them, they I think they see it as a sign of weakness,
Yeah.
that you're paying someone to tell you things that you probably know anyway.
Yeah.
And then the other issue is, right, in Western therapy, a lot of the solutions, or a lot of the discussion or the analysis centers around your upbringing and your parents and how you grew up and how your parents raised you and stuff, which can actually have a negative effect on your relationship with your parents. Like, if this therapist is telling you to like distance yourself from your parents because they were toxic, or that they didn't I don't know, equip you emotionally in life or whatever, you know they're trying to, like, the way my culture would see it, and I would see it this way too, is like, oh my God, like you're driving a wedge between like this individual and their parents. Like, you can't divorce
Yeah.
your parents in my culture. Not possible, you know? Like, no matter how bad they are, and I think maybe that's another reason maybe my parents and their generation kind of feel like therapy is it's like almost a bad word.
Yeah, they're very dubious about the practice for sure, and they're a bit like, I think, yes. First, they're like, wait, you're gonna air your dirty laundry, and on top of that, you're gonna pay someone to do that,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah, yeah, yeah.
then there's also this sense of like, well, what's wrong with you? And you're like, well, maybe this isn't about wrong, but certain things could be improved, or that I need, and it's like, I feel like in our cultures they can maybe with their resilience or with their maybe lack of awareness comes this sense, well, this is normal, like this is, having these issues or these thoughts or whatever is normal, you just live with it. Like, why are you
Absolutely.
going off and trying to tinker around? You're like,
Absolutely,
well.
absolutely, and in fact, I still remember, like, my mom would have said something along those lines to my brother, like, "Well, hold on a second. You think you're unique? Like, you think you're special? Like, you're struggling to find love or a girlfriend or hold a relationship down. Like, what? You think you're special? Like, millions of people have this problem." And I was like, "Mom, probably not the best thing to say, like, because I mean, she means it in. I get her intention." I actually wanted to say this. Like, I feel like I'm my whole life trying to prove my Indianness to my own parents. Like, I'm never Indian enough, because I will never be as Indian as they are. But they can't get inside my head. They can only understand the world from their own, life and experience. So they're always wanting me to be more than I can offer. And I think this goes back to the therapy thing. And, I think part of the reason my brother is seeing a therapist is because he feels that he didn't learn or didn't see the kinds of ways to show affection and romantic love and things like that because he didn't see it from his parents.
Hello, listeners. Sorry to interrupt, but my conversation with Bhanu was abruptly ended by my laptop crashing. The joys of tech. Oh well. We were at the end of our conversation anyway, but sadly you'll have to do without our warm goodbyes. He does send his warm regards to you all. If you'd like to know more about Bhanu's journey with yoga, he did make a great film about the practice while he was at Al Jazeera, and it's called Who Owns Yoga? You can find it on YouTube, and I'll include the link with other recommended reading in the show notes. Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to this episode. Check out the show notes for more details about my wonderful guests, including where you can find them on social media. If you enjoyed listening to this, please do spread the good word, share with friends, family, cousins, and colleagues, and please, please, please like and leave a review on whatever platform you are listening to this podcast. Your support is crucial for the show's success, and a couple of clicks from you will mean the world to me. Go to my website, leilamaghrabi.com, and follow me on Instagram and Twitter for more news on future episodes.